I had sworn an oath years ago to save every life that came through those doors, no exceptions. But nothing prepares you for the night fate wheels your own father into the trauma bay, dying, and dares you to decide whether he deserves to live. For 22 years, I told myself I hated him. For 22 years, I believed he killed my mother. And now his heart was failing in my hands, and only I could stop it. What would you do if the man you'd spent your whole life hating was suddenly your patient, and only you could save him? St. Agnes Hospital sat buried in the cold November night out on the edge of Chicago, and at 2 in the morning the ambulance sirens tore through that quiet like something ripping. Red and blue light washed across the emergency room windows in slow pulsing waves. I was in the doctor's lounge holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at my phone without actually seeing it. 36 hours since my last real shift ended. My body ached with the particular exhaustion only medicine teaches you, but my mind stayed strangely alert, like it was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know yet that it was. The door swung open. Nurse Carla Nguyen leaned in, her voice sharp with urgency. "Dr. Bennett, we've got a critical case coming in. Heart attack, male 68. EMS is bringing him in now." I stood up on pure reflex, the coffee forgotten. "What's his condition?" "Ventricular fibrillation. They shocked him twice in the ambulance. Blood pressure's dropping. Looks like serious valve damage." Carla glanced down at the paper in her hand, then hesitated in a way that made my stomach tighten before she even said it. "Doctor, the patient's name is Harold Bennett." The cup nearly slipped out of my hand. For a second, the whole hallway seemed to go silent around me. That name, the one I had refused to say out loud for 8 years, rang through the corridor like something final, like a verdict being read. "You're sure?" My own voice sounded strange to me, thin and far away. "The address on his license matches the old hospital records. Lives alone out in Peoria." I didn't answer her. I just walked every step heavier than the last until I reached the glass of Trauma Bay 3. Through it, I saw an elderly man lying still on the stretcher, his face the color of ash, a tube down his throat, ECG leads tangled across a bare chest that used to seem invincible to me. It was my father. 20 years earlier, that man had stood like a mountain in his uniform, his voice booming through our house whenever he gave an order. Now he was just a thin, trembling body under a hospital blanket, skin loose over the bones, hair gone white as frost. I hadn't seen him age. I hadn't let myself see him at all. Dr. Marcus Webb, our chief of cardiology, came up beside me and put a hand on my shoulder. "Ethan, I know this is complicated. You want me to hand it off to someone else?" I looked through the glass one more time. Somewhere under my ribs, a heart that had cut open hundreds of strangers without flinching was now hammering with something I refused to name. "No," I said, and I heard my own voice harden as I said it. "I'll take it." But the second the words left my mouth, another voice rose up inside me. An old, bitter voice that had been sleeping for 22 years and was now waking like a wound torn back open. "Let him die. It's what he deserves." I clenched my fists and pushed through the door anyway. The nurses were already moving fast around the stretcher. The monitor beeped weak and irregular, a rhythm that sounded more like a warning than a heartbeat. "Blood pressure 80/50 and falling," one of them called out. "Rhythm's unstable." I stepped closer, and that's when my father's eyes, still conscious, barely opened and found my face. "Ethan." His voice came out as a cracked whisper. "Is that you?" I didn't answer right away. I bent down, pressed the stethoscope to his chest, forcing my hands to stay steady when everything in me wanted to shake. In my ears, his heartbeat sounded chaotic, like distant war drums I hadn't heard in decades, but somehow still recognized. "Don't talk, Dad." I made my voice flat, professional, cold on purpose. "Save your strength." But his eyes never left mine. And in them, I saw something I had never seen in 42 years of knowing him, the raw fear of a man staring straight at death, and underneath that something worse. The recognition that the only person who could save him was the one he had hurt the most. "Get him up to the cath lab now," I ordered, my voice finding its steel again. "I need a clear look at that valve before we make any decisions." When the team wheeled him out, I stood alone in the empty bay, breathing hard, staring down at my own hands. These were the hands that had held a scalpel thousands of times, hands that had saved more lives than I could count. Could those same hands save the man who once left my mother to die completely alone? I didn't have an answer, but I knew that tonight fate had put something terrible in my grip, the power to decide whether my own father lived or died. I was 12 the first time I understood something had gone wrong inside the small house on the edge of Peoria. My father, Colonel Harold Bennett, had just come home from his final deployment, and he wasn't the same man who'd left 3 years earlier. The father I remembered from before the war was the one who taught me to fish down by the lake, who carried me on his shoulders to watch the fireworks every 4th of July, who had a laugh like thunder and a smile that filled up a room. The man who came back was something else entirely, a silent shadow of a person, eyes always fixed on some place none of the rest of us could see. My mother, Grace Bennett, was the only one who kept trying to close the gap that kept widening between Harold and the rest of the world. She stayed up night after night, sitting at the edge of the bed when he jerked awake from nightmares, whispering him back to calm when his whole body shook with something I didn't have a name for yet. "Your father's fighting a different war now," she told me once, her voice gentle, but her eyes so tired. "One inside his own head. You have to be patient with him." But patience has a limit, and we found it. Harold started drinking more. Rage would come out of nowhere over the smallest things: a door slammed too hard, a car horn out on the street, even just the sound of me laughing with friends in the yard. The night that changed everything was a rainy night in March. I was 12, lying in my room listening to the fight downstairs. My father's voice roaring through the floorboards, my mother's voice begging him to calm down. Then a crash. Then footsteps fast and frantic. Then silence, the kind that presses down on your chest. I never knew exactly what happened that night. What I did know was that the next morning, my mother was found at the bottom of the stairs, her head against the granite steps. Police called it an accident, said she'd slipped trying to leave the house in the middle of a rainstorm. But even at 12, I'd heard enough through that floor to doubt it was that simple. I remembered my father shouting something about betrayal, my mother sobbing, pleading, the sound of rage that had lost all its edges. Harold never once spoke about that night. He sank deeper into the bottle and the silence, and 3 months later he left town altogether, dropping me off with my grandmother and promising he'd come back once things were more stable. That promise never really got kept. He sent money sometimes, called on birthdays occasionally, but the distance between us only grew wider, a crack that never closed no matter how much time passed over it. In the years after, every time I watched another family gathered around a dinner table, every time a friend mentioned a weekend fishing trip with his dad, something dull and sharp cut through me at once. My grandmother loved me completely. I never doubted that, but she couldn't fill the space two parents had left behind. She never brought up Harold on her own, and whenever I asked about the night my mother died, her face would go tight and she'd change the subject fast. When I was 15, Harold came back for a short visit, 3 days. He brought a new fishing rod, tried to recreate those afternoons at the lake from years before, like nothing had happened in between. I sat there the whole time in silence, refusing to give him anything, until he finally left a day early, shoulders slumped with a disappointment he didn't bother hiding. That was the last time I saw him face to face before the night of the emergency, 22 years later. I grew up carrying one question I never got an answer to. What had my father actually done to my mother that night? I had no proof. Just the broken pieces of a 12-year-old's memory and a grief too big to see clearly through. But in my mind over the years, that story hardened into something I treated as absolute fact, that my father lost in the uncontrolled rage of a soldier carrying wounds nobody back then had the courage to name had caused my mother's death. Whether directly or not, in my mind it didn't matter. He'd caused it. I chose medicine with a quiet, private determination I never told a soul about. I wanted to become the person who could save what my father had failed or refused to protect. Every successful surgery was proof to myself, proof that I was different, that I could hold real power in my hands and never once lose control of it, unlike the man whose anger had taken the life of the woman he swore he loved. But somewhere underneath all of that, some part of me had never actually forgiven him. Some part still carried the bitter question quiet, but never fully silent. If fate ever put my father's life in my hands, would I save him? Now, 22 years later, that question wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was 3 in the morning and the coronary angiogram results came up on the screen in front of me. My heart, the doctor's heart, the one trained to stay level, sank at how bad it looked. Severe aortic valve damage plus blockages across all 3 major coronary arteries, Dr. Webb said, pointing at the images. This is about as complex as surgery gets. We're talking valve replacement combined with bypass grafts on a 68-year-old with high blood pressure and probably chronic lung damage from decades of smoking. He turned to look at me directly. Honestly, this is the kind of case I'd only trust to a handful of surgeons in this whole hospital. You're one of them, maybe the best one. I stared at the screen feeling like I was standing at a crossroads with no road leading out of it. What's the success rate if we operate right away? I asked, keeping my voice as professional as I could force it to be. Around 60%. Higher maybe with a surgeon who has real depth of experience with this kind of injury. Webb paused, studying my face like he already suspected something was wrong. Without surgery, he won't make it 48 hours. The words just hung there in the air like a sentence being read out. I walked out of the reading room down the empty midnight corridor, my mind spinning between two images. My father's ashen face on the stretcher and my mother's face in the last photograph I still kept taking, only a week before that rainy night took her from us. I stopped at the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the dark, empty parking lot. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face staring back the face of a 42-year-old man who in that exact moment felt exactly like the 12-year-old boy standing on the stairs looking down at his mother's body. He doesn't deserve to live, that old bitter voice said inside me. He took your mother. He abandoned you. Now fate's handed you the chance for justice, and you don't even have to lift a finger. Just let it happen. I wouldn't have to hurt him at all. I could simply refuse the case, cite a personal conflict of interest, a completely legitimate, defensible reason. The hospital would find another surgeon, maybe someone less experienced with lower odds of success. Nobody would blame me for it. Nobody would ever know what was really sitting in my chest. But could I actually live with that? I pulled out my phone and scrolled down to a number I rarely used: my therapist, the person I'd spent years talking to about the wounds childhood leaves behind. Then I stopped before I dialed. This wasn't a moment for advice. This was the moment to face the thing that had been asleep inside me for 22 years. I thought about the Hippocratic Oath, the one I'd recited on graduation day, standing with my classmates, hand over my heart, swearing I would never do harm, that I would serve every patient with the same dedication, no exceptions. Back then, I believed every word of it completely. I'd treated it like the compass for my whole career. But that oath had never been tested like this. Not when the man on the table wasn't a stranger, but the one who had planted the deepest pain of my entire life. Ethan walked back to his office, sat down at the computer, and pulled up his father's chart. Scrolling through the intake information, he stopped on the emergency contact field. Blank. No name filled in. For 22 years, his father had lived alone. No wife, no partner, and apparently no one to call in an emergency except the one son he had once walked away from. A strange feeling rose in Ethan then, not quite pity, but something close enough to it that it caught him off guard. He found himself wondering how Harold had spent all those years alone in that small house in Peoria, just him and whatever ghosts the war had left behind, and maybe the ghost of the wife he'd lost too. Ethan closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the nurse's station. "Prep the OR," he said, keeping his voice hard even though everything underneath it was tearing. "Surgery this morning. I'll do it myself." But as he turned to walk away, another thought slid in quietly behind the decision. Choosing to operate didn't mean he had forgiven anything. It only meant he wasn't ready to become a killer, even one by indifference. The real fight between the oath he'd sworn and the hatred still smoldering somewhere under his ribs was still ahead of him. Before the 7 o'clock surgery, Ethan needed to go through his father's full medical history, especially the medications, to avoid any dangerous interaction under anesthesia. He called the house in Peoria and reached the neighbor listed in the old hospital file, a woman named Dorothy Chen, and asked her to find the current prescriptions and fax them over. An hour later, Dorothy called back, her voice trembling. "Dr. Bennett, I'm so sorry to hear about Harold. He was a good neighbor, even if he kept mostly to himself. I found the prescriptions in the kitchen cabinet. I'll fax those right over. But I also found this. I don't know if you'd want it." "What is it, Mrs. Chen?" "A notebook. Looks like a journal. Your name's in it a lot. I thought maybe you should have it." 30 minutes later, a scanned copy landed in his inbox. Ethan sat in the lounge, hands not quite steady, and opened the attachment to find pages of shaky, uneven handwriting, the handwriting of a man whose hands had probably been shaking for years. The early pages were ordinary notes about tending a small garden, a veterans meeting, aching knees in the cold. But the deeper Ethan read, the clearer it became that this wasn't an ordinary journal at all. These were confessions written by a lonely man trying to face a past he'd never once had the courage to say out loud to another living person. March 14th. Today is Grace's anniversary. 22 years. I still remember that night like it was yesterday, not because I pushed her the way I know Ethan has believed all these years. I never laid a hand on her, but I did something almost as bad. I shouted terrible things at her, blamed her for not understanding what I'd been through, when all she was trying to do was tell me she was scared for Ethan's safety every time my temper took over the house. She ran out of the bedroom crying, trying to get downstairs in the dark to call her sister. I stood at the top of those stairs yelling things after her that I would give anything to take back now. She slipped. I ran down after her, but it was already too late. Ethan stopped reading. His hand was shaking hard enough that he set the phone down on the arm of the chair before it slipped. Tears came without warning, sudden and unstoppable. Not because the pain he'd carried for 22 years had finally been confirmed, but because the truth turned out to be so much more complicated than anything he'd let himself imagine. His father hadn't pushed his mother, but the aftermath of things Harold had seen at war wounds that had never been properly treated because of pride and because of what mental health meant or didn't mean in the military of that era, had built the exact conditions that led to her death. It wasn't murder, but it wasn't some clean, blameless accident either. It sat in a space Ethan had never allowed himself to imagine existed. He kept reading. He couldn't stop now even if he wanted to. I never had the courage to tell Ethan the truth. How could I look my own son in the eye and tell him his mother's death started with my anger? Even if I never touched her, I was afraid he'd hate me even more than he already did. So I chose silence, and silence became a prison. I locked myself inside for 22 years. I stayed away from him not because I stopped loving him, but because I didn't have the courage to face what I'd caused, and I didn't have the courage to let him see me. A father who failed in the worst way there is. I know my heart's getting worse. The doctors keep telling me I need surgery, but I've put it off. Maybe part of me thought that if I died, it would be a kind of justice for what I caused. But another part of me, the weak, selfish part, kept hoping that one day I could tell Ethan the truth, and maybe he could find a way to forgive me. Not because I deserve it, but because he deserves to live the rest of his life without carrying the weight of hating me. Ethan sat motionless in the lounge chair, the glow of the phone screen burning against his palms. For 22 years, he had built an entire life, his career, his personality, even the careful distance he kept from anyone who tried to get close on top of a story he had believed was absolute, unshakable truth. Now that truth had come apart in his hands, revealing something far messier underneath no clean villain, no perfectly innocent victim, just two wounded people, each carrying grief in his own broken way, both trapped inside a tragedy neither of them had ever had the courage to look at directly. The clock on the wall struck 6:30, 30 minutes until surgery. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, stood up, and walked toward the room where his father was being prepped. This time, he didn't walk in as a doctor doing his job. He walked in as a son, carrying a truth he'd only just discovered, and a decision that had to be made before there was no more time left to make it. Harold Bennett lay in the hospital bed, already given a light sedative to prepare him for surgery, but still awake enough to recognize the shape standing in the doorway. His old eyes went wide when he saw Ethan there, phone still in hand, the journal already read, and sitting between them like a third presence in the room. "You read it?" Harold said, his voice trembling not just from the medication, but from something deeper. "Dorothy sent it to you. You knew she had it." Ethan stepped closer to the bed, his voice pulled tight. "I gave it to her for safekeeping in case something happened to me. I thought, maybe one day you'd need to know the truth, even if I never had the courage to say it to your face myself." Harold tried to push himself upright, but the pain in his chest made him wince and fall back against the pillow. Ethan stood there in silence, looking down at the man who had once been the tallest mountain in his entire world, now nothing but a fragile shadow under a thin hospital blanket. 22 years, Dad." His voice came out thick, caught between anger and something rawer underneath it. 22 years I lived believing you killed Mom, that you pushed her down those stairs in some drunken rage. I hated you for that my whole adult life. I didn't push her. Tears slid down the wrinkled skin of Harold's face. I swear to you, Ethan, I never laid a violent hand on your mother. But I did something almost as bad. I let my rage, the ghosts I brought home from that war, turn our house into a place she had to run from in the middle of the night. That's on me, Ethan. Not directly, but still mine. Then why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me grow up hating you for a crime you didn't even commit? Harold closed his eyes, tears still tracking down. Because I was a coward. I stood in artillery fire, faced death on the battlefield without flinching once. But I didn't have the courage to look my own son in the eye and tell him his father helped cause his mother's death. I was afraid of losing you completely. So I left instead and let you build your own version of the story, even if that version made you hate me more than the truth ever would have. Ethan sank down into the chair beside the bed, head dropping into his hands. I became a doctor because of you, you know that, not to follow you. To prove I was nothing like you. To prove I could save people, that I could hold real power and never once lose control of it, unlike you who lost control and took Mom away from both of us. And now, Harold said, his voice pleading, you're holding my life in those same hands. I understand if you want to let me go, Ethan. I won't blame you for it. Maybe that's exactly what I deserve after everything I caused. A heavy silence settled over the room. Ethan looked into his father's eyes, the same eyes that had once terrified him during childhood rages, now holding nothing but the weakness and remorse of an old man staring straight at his own death. You know, Ethan said slowly, I've trained thousands of hours to be able to do a surgery like this one. I've saved strangers I'd never met before in my life, never hesitated for a second, because that's the oath I took. But when I saw you on that stretcher last night for the first time in my whole career, I actually asked myself if I wanted to save my patient. Harold shut his eyes, bracing for whatever came next. But I realized something. Ethan went on, his voice softening despite himself. If I let you die because of hatred, I'd become exactly the thing I've spent my whole life afraid of becoming, a man who lets anger decide his actions the same way you once did. I don't want to be that person, Dad. I've spent my entire life making sure I'm not. Ethan stood, reached out, and took his father's trembling hand in his. I'm going to do the surgery. Not because I've completely forgiven you, I think I'm going to need more time for that. But because I'm a doctor and you're my patient, and because underneath all of it, after 22 years, you're still my father. Tears ran freely down Harold's face now. A weak, genuine smile touched his cracked lips. Thank you, Ethan. Whatever happens on that table, thank you for giving me the chance to finally tell the truth. A nurse stepped in to say it was time to move him to the operating room. As they wheeled the bed out into the hallway, Harold gripped his son's hand one last time. I love you, Ethan. I always loved you, even through those years of shameful silence. I know, Ethan whispered, though his heart was still caught somewhere between grief and resolve. Now let me do my job. Operating room 4 blazed under the sterile white lights. Ethan stood at the table, gloves already on, looking down at his father's chest, prepped and draped, marked now only as a surgical field, no longer the image of the man he'd once known, feared and hated in equal measure. Ready, Dr. Bennett? Dr. Webb asked from across the table, ready to assist. Ethan drew a long breath. Ready, let's begin. The surgery unfolded in total concentration. Ethan made the first incision with the precision of thousands of hours behind it. But underneath the calm professional surface, his mind kept circling back the rainy night 22 years ago, tangled together with the shaky handwriting he'd read only hours before. When he finally opened the chest and looked directly at his father's weakly beating heart, something strange moved through him. Like for the first time in his whole life, he was seeing his father completely undefended. No mask, no armor, just the most fragile organ in the human body, waiting entirely on the decisions of Ethan's hands. Severe calcification of the aortic valve matches the imaging, Ethan said, keeping his voice level and clinical, even as a storm raged somewhere underneath it. Prep the heart-lung machine. We'll need to stop the heart to replace the valve. 30 minutes into the case, as Ethan carefully cut away the damaged tissue, the monitor suddenly screamed a warning. Harold's blood pressure was crashing. Pressure's dropping fast, 60/40, and still falling, the anesthesiologist called out. Any internal bleeding? Ethan's eyes scanned the surgical field fast and sharp. No unusual bleeding. Webb answered, tension cutting through his voice. Could be a reaction to the anesthesia on top of an already weakened heart. In that chaotic second, a part of Ethan's mind buried for 22 years, but never fully gone, whispered something dark and familiar. This could just be how it ends, not your fault. Just fate finishing what it started. But the moment that thought flared up, Ethan also remembered his father's face on the hospital bed only hours earlier. The genuine remorse, the tears of a man who had spent 22 years in silent torment, just waiting for one chance to finally speak the truth out loud. Increase the fluids, get the epinephrine ready. Ethan ordered, his voice hardening into something decisive, no hesitation left anywhere in it. "We are not losing this patient. Keep going." The team moved in tight coordination under Ethan's command, working through the tense minutes it took to stabilize Harold's blood pressure. Every second stretched longer than it should have, Ethan calling out orders in a voice that gave nothing away, while somewhere underneath his ribs, his own heart hammered as hard as the one he was fighting to save. Slowly, the numbers on the monitor began to climb back towards something survivable. "Pressure's coming up. 90/60, the anesthesiologist reported, relief creeping into her voice for the first time. When the situation finally settled, Ethan went back into the surgery with even sharper focus than before, as if every suture, every precise movement of his hands was a quiet answer to a question he'd been asking himself all night, that he would not let hatred write the ending to this story. 4 hours after the first incision, with the new valve seated and the coronary bypasses complete, Ethan stepped back from the table and watched his father's heart begin to beat in a steady, normal rhythm on the monitor. Strong, even, alive. Rhythm stable. Blood pressure back to normal, the anesthesiologist said, and this time there was no mistaking the relief in her voice. Ethan looked down at that heart, closed now, inside his father's chest, beating on its own, and felt something wash over him that wasn't just the relief of a technically successful surgery. It was the relief of having survived the hardest test of his entire career, the battle between the oath he'd sworn as a young man and the ghost of hatred that had followed him for 22 years. "Surgery successful," he said, his voice slightly unsteady with exhaustion and everything underneath it. "Take him to recovery." When he peeled off his gloves and walked out of the OR, Ethan felt his legs nearly give out beneath him, not from 4 straight hours under the surgical lights, but from the sheer emotional weight of what he'd just carried through that room. Dr. Webb put a hand on his shoulder as they both stripped off their gowns in the changing room. "I've watched hundreds of surgeries in my career," Webb said quietly, "but I've never seen anyone stay as steady as you did when that pressure dropped. A lot of experienced surgeons would have panicked in that moment, especially with family on the table." Ethan sat down hard on the bench, face in his hands. "There was a second," he admitted, his voice low, "when part of me thought about letting go. Just for a second. But then I remembered why I became a doctor in the first place." Webb nodded, didn't push for more, just rested a knowing hand on his younger colleague's shoulder for a moment. "Sometimes the hardest surgeries aren't the ones on the table, Ethan. They're the ones inside our own heads. You made it through both today." 3 days after the surgery, Harold Bennett woke in the intensive care unit, his body still weak, but his heart rhythm steady and strong on the monitor beside him. November morning light came in, slanted through the window, warming a room that was usually too cold, too sterile to feel like anything but a hospital. Ethan sat in the chair beside the bed. His shift had ended hours ago, and he was out of the white coat now, just a plain sweater and the kind of tiredness that goes bone deep. He'd been there since early morning, watching every number on the monitor, the way a worried son watches, not the way a doctor on duty does. "You're still here," Harold whispered when his eyes opened, his voice weak but clearer than it had been the night of the emergency. "I'm still here," Ethan confirmed and reached over to take his father's hand. Harold looked down at the hand holding his, and tears started rolling again down the deep lines of his face. "I didn't think I deserved this. You being here. After everything I hid from you all these years. I've been thinking a lot these past 3 days," Ethan said slowly, choosing each word with care. "About what you wrote in that journal, about what you told me before the surgery, and I realized I spent 22 years carrying around a version of you in my head, a simple monster, easy to hate, easy to blame for everything. But the truth turned out to be a lot more complicated than that. You're not that monster. You're a man carrying wounds that never got treated properly. And those wounds cause consequences you never meant to cause." "That doesn't make me innocent," Harold said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't. But it means I can't keep living inside a story that's just black and white. Mom's death was a tragedy, one you carry real responsibility for, but not the deliberate crime I spent my whole life believing it was. And I think it might finally be time I stopped carrying the weight of hating you around on my shoulders." Harold tightened his grip on his son's hand, his voice breaking apart on the next words. "Are you saying you forgive me?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the morning light falling across the buildings of Chicago. "I think forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once, Dad. It's a process. But I want to start it. I don't want to keep living as a man who carries a fire of hatred around inside him every day. That night on the table when I watched your heart stop for a second, I understood something. If you died with all of this still unresolved between us, I would have had to live with that for the rest of my life. Not the relief I always thought I'd feel. Something else. Another wound. One that never would have closed. I'm sorry, Ethan, Harold said, his voice shaking with something raw and real. I'm sorry I stayed quiet for so long. Sorry I let you grow up under a lie I should have had the courage to correct years ago. I know, Ethan said, squeezing his father's hand gently. And I think from here we can start learning how to build something again. Not to forget what happened, but so it stops being the thing that keeps both of us locked up forever. Harold looked at his son, and in those old, tired eyes, Ethan saw something he hadn't seen in decades. Not the ghosts of war, not the weight of guilt, but something fragile and small and real. Hope. When I'm stronger, Harold said, I want to visit your mother's grave. With you. It's been 22 years since I had the courage to face that place at all, let alone stand there beside you. I'll take you, Ethan answered gently. We'll go together. Outside the window, a flock of birds crossed the gray Chicago sky, heading south for the winter. In that small hospital room, father and son, the doctor who had saved the father who once caused him the deepest pain of his life, and the veteran who had finally found the son he thought he'd lost for good, sat together in a silence that no longer weighed anything down. Not the old kind of silence heavy with things left unsaid. A different kind now. Lighter. Loosened by the truth finally being set free between them. It wasn't a perfect ending. There was still a long road of healing ahead, still hard conversations neither of them had had yet. But for the first time in 22 years, both father and son felt something they'd lost a long time ago. A new beginning built not on hatred or silence, but on truth, on forgiveness, and on a love that had somehow quietly survived even the longest years apart. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, I want to know what you would have done in Ethan's place. Would you have picked up the scalpel, or would you have walked away? Leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. We share stories like this one every single day, so if it meant something to you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Some wounds take 22 years to speak out loud, but it's never too late to start. Let's keep walking this road together.